As the United States ramps up tensions in the new Cold War, America's military machine has been hollowed out by inefficiency and corruption. All right, guys, hello and welcome to another episode of Thinking Out Loud. This week, we're going to be discussing something that I feel is pretty pressing, given the ongoing rising tensions with China, ongoing rising tensions with Russia, the coming or the becoming of a new Cold War. The war in Ukraine, one of America's proxy wars, which is one of many to be coming in the near future, I'm sure. We're going to be discussing United States military hegemony. We're going to be discussing the military-industrial complex. We're going to be discussing, in particular, how this military-industrial complex, despite all of the propaganda surrounding, U.S. military might. I mean, you see it all the time in movies like, Top Gun, older movies like Saving Private Ryan, Mission Impossible, all this stuff. Endless amounts of propaganda, recruitment commercials, things like that. Everywhere you see something about the U.S. military in this country, right? The perks of living in a fascist state. Despite this propaganda, we're going to dive into the reality behind the U.S. military machine and the fact that despite the hundreds of billions, over $1 trillion probably if you consider the black budget of spending that we do on the U.S. military, it is becoming increasingly inefficient. It is riddled with corruption, both in the military itself and the military industrial complex of corporations that contract with the U.S. Defense Department. We're going to be discussing all these things to kind of paint a picture of how even as, U.S. hegemony begins to fray at the edges in other ways, such as diplomatically, economically, particularly with the rise of China, the linchpin has still sort of been the, might of the U.S. military machine, but we're going to analyze how even that, U.S. military hegemony is beginning to decay, that it is also a victim, so to speak, of the imperial decay that is facing the American empire on all fronts, right? So going into this, we're going to be discussing quite a few different sources. I'll pull up some of these here for you guys. This first one is from Foreign Affairs. So the first part of this discussion, we're going to be discussing this article here from Foreign Affairs, How America Broke Its War Machine, Privatization and the Hollowing Out of the U.S. Defense Industry. So with this article, we're going to be discussing in particular the reality that U.S. arms production, U.S. military production is not as all-encompassing as you might think. In fact, it has a lot of weaknesses, a lot of weak points in the armor. Despite all that propaganda like we discussed. From there, we're going to be moving into, how this shows up in the current day, in particular, the CBS News article. We've all seen, articles and stories about how we are somehow, despite all this military production, short on giving Ukraine the supposed military aid that it needs, right? We are running out of shells. Ammunition is in short supply, and we're going to be dissecting that as well. We'll also be, from there, moving on to how the U.S. military and U.S. contractors are riddled with corruption. Like, corruption in the U.S. military is, just hand and parcel. It is part of the everyday life. So we're going to be getting into some of that, and in particular, some of the cases of military defense contractors, Department of Defense contractors, i.e. a famous example being Halliburton, absolutely gaming the system and overcharging the federal government because there's no oversight. And, of course, in a lot of instances, the same people running these defense contractor corporations, Halliburton, Boeing, things like that, Raytheon, they are in the government. They are the government, right? So that's kind of the whole picture we're going to be discussing here, right? Imperial decay in the U.S. war machine. So let's go ahead and jump into this first article here, guys. Again, this is from Foreign Affairs, How America Broke Its War Machine, Privatization and the Hollowing Out of the U.S. Defense Industry. This is from Michael Brenz. I pulled up his little LinkedIn type thing right here, right? He's a professor at Yale. I was looking at his Twitter as well. Pretty, center left, at least nominally left wing. He recognizes the issues that are facing the United States, particularly corporate domination and things like this. So he wrote this article. He has a pretty keen eye for these things, and he's at least sympathetic to the actual causes of some of the issues we're facing. That being said, still liberal, still I would imagine, U.S. patriot, believes in the United States. It just believes that it's lost its way, sort of the whole Cicero, sort of this, the old Cicero situation where I believe in Rome, but I believe it's lost its way, right? But from more and more left perspective, right? So this is who this article's from, guys. So we'll go ahead and jump into the reading here. We do have a lot to cover, so I'm going to try to read quickly and do as best coverage as I can along the way, all right? It says the United States pledged its unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty. This support has materialized in over $75 billion in security assistance to date, with the United States committed to aiding Ukraine until the fighting stops, which God knows how long that could be, guys. These unlimited commitments to furnishing Ukraine with weapons to counter Russian aggression have invoked parallels to World War II. The United States and its allies are serving as the arsenal of democracy, giving the defenders of freedom the material means to keep fighting in Ukraine. The journalist Elliot Ackerman then wrote that the workers building missiles for Ukraine's defense are a key component of America's arsenal for democracy. President Joe Biden has also embraced the arsenal of democracy analogy when he visited a Lockheed Martin plant in Troy, Alabama. In May last year, Biden told the audience that the United States built the weapons and the equipment that helped defend freedom and sovereignty in years ago, and is doing so again today. So obviously, you've probably heard this if you've been through any high school, high school U.S. history class. One of the big things I always talk about is in World War I, but more particularly in World War II, FDR had a whole slogan about being the arsenal of democracy when he, wanted to get involved in the war. But back at home, people were really not on board with that, especially after the boondoggle that was World War I. People considered World War I as a banker's war, as an imperialist war. And they were worried about, coming in to, sacrifice lives and money to bail Europe out of one of its bullshit wars again, right? So when he was in this position where he, wanted to get into the war, but didn't really have the consent for it politically yet, we started arming the Allied powers, right? At first, it was cash to carry, where you had to pay in cash or other resources in order to get the weapons. And then as the war carried on, FDR sort of implemented a thing where we would loan you unlimited amounts of dollars with the idea that it would be paid back at the end of the war, which we did end up making the Allies pay back all of that debt, which is absolutely insane. To end fascism, we made them pay back all that debt, so they could get unlimited amounts of arms and other military supplies and resources necessary for the war. And he said that America was the arsenal of democracy. We're not going to fight in this war, but we can be an arsenal for democracy, right? So President Joe Biden and his cabinet and other, politicians, particularly in the military-industrial complex, I imagine, are pushing that same narrative, hearkening back to this time period, because it's a war in Europe, right? So they're trying to draw those parallels, right? Let's go on here, guys. It says, shortages in production, inadequate labor pools, and interruptions in supply chains have hamstrung the United States' ability to deliver weapons to Ukraine and enhance the country's defense capabilities more broadly. These problems have much to do with the history of the U.S. defense industry since World War II, creeping privatization during the Cold War, along with diminished federal investment and oversight of defense contracting since the 1960s, help bring about the inefficiency, waste, and lack of prioritization that are complicating U.S. assistance to Ukraine today. So, guys, I really like this article because it's very succinct. There is a lot of reading out of it, but it lays out all the deeply systemic, rotten to the core issues that we have with the military-industrial complex. And guess what? No surprise, it's the same sort of issues facing every other sector of the U.S. economy in social and political and communal life as well, right? Privatization, neoliberalism, debt financing, inefficiency, making it into another racket, right? It's absolutely crazy, and this is a great article, guys. It says here, major players in the U.S. defense industry consolidated and downsized their operations and labor forces. Government contracts for expensive experimental weaponry to obtain larger profits to the detriment of small arms and ammunition production. As a result, the industry has been underprepared in responding to the Ukraine crisis and unmoored from the broader national security needs of the United States and its allies. With this, too, I remember reading articles about the U.S. military being unprepared despite all the money that we dump into the military-industrial complex during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. When those were really starting to escalate in the early 2000s, I remember there being all kinds of articles and news coverage about, troops having the wrong vehicles, not getting the supplies that they needed, particularly MREs and ammunition, not having the right boots, not having the right uniforms for the heat. And it actually took almost a whole decade for the United States military to kind of revamp from its... I guess I would assume that a lot of the U.S. military production at that time, just prior to the war in the 90s in particular, would have been oriented more towards Latin America because they were producing a lot of military equipment for the sort of jungle and mountain scenes down there, because the U.S., particularly under Reagan and again under Clinton, was, fighting all these proxy wars in Latin America, trying to overthrow left-wing regimes, funding, and bankrolling the military machines of, fascist, genocidal, cadre groups and mercenary groups, right? Like the Contras and stuff like that. So I imagine a lot of that had to be switched over. I mean, there was the first Iraq war in the 90s, but that was relatively short-lived. So I don't even imagine production changed very much during that. So the point I'm making is they had to do this whole complete switch around, and it took a long time. I mean, if you ask veterans, they'll tell you how short some of the supplies were at certain times, right? All right, let's dive into a little bit of the nitty-gritty of this here, guys. See what they got to say. It says, the way we were, so this part's going to get into how defense production used to be used and advocated for in the U.S. government and the U.S. military, right? Today's defense industry bears no resemblance to the U.S. system of military production during World War II. Back then, the industry was predominantly a government-run business. President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal emphasized economic regulation and relied on alphabet agencies such as the Works Progress Administration to boost employment, paving the way for later wartime contracting. So what he's saying here is that sort of alphabet soup illusion during the FDR administration, his advocacy to create all these different organizations, Public Work Administration, war, and then again it says here later the War Production Board. It sort of laid the groundwork so that when a crisis, the crisis of World War II, a global war hit, there was already the capacity of the U.S. government to produce these agencies and produce these oversight boards that would allow the government to guide production for the necessity of the war, right? Okay, so that is just apples and oranges to what it is today, as we will see, right? Let's see here. New Deal agencies inspired the creation of the War Production Board in 1942, which mobilized business and rationed resources for the battlefront. Weapons production was concentrated in shipbuilding and aircraft, with companies based mainly in industrial centers in the Northeast and Midwest and government-owned, government-operated facilities known as GOGO plants. The government owned nearly 90% of the productive capacity of aircraft, ships, and guns and ammunition. That's crazy. Own 90% of the productive capacity. That means they own 90% of the plants through GOGO. Through the GOGO format, government-owned, government-operated facilities. 90%. So when you hear all the propaganda and the hearkening back to a better time, and people talk about U.S. military might and our ability to produce on a mass scale, to be the quote-unquote arsenal of democracy, keep in mind that was back when the U.S. military and the military-industrial complex was just beginning to form, and it was 90% owned by the government and completely directed by the government, right? Insane to even think about. I mean, it's such a far cry from now, right? Let's see. This is in contrast to today's climate, where commercial items have made up over 88% of new procurement awards since 2011. That's a complete 180. That's a complete flip-flop, man. And private capital invests over $6 billion a year in the defense industry. Yeah, so, and as we'll see, there's little to no government oversight anymore when it comes to this sort of stuff. I mean, case in point, we'll be talking about Halliburton later and these other defense. I mean, the people that run the defense corporations are in the government and they write the contracts. We actually did an episode some time back talking about insider trading, where the people that are writing or going back through the defense appropriations bill have huge investments and stakeholders with some of these defense contractors. So you literally have them writing the bill for what the government's going to spend money on while they own company stock for the company that's going to make the shit that the government's spending money on, right? So they will literally be like, oh, they could go through the bill and be like, oh, I see we're going to buy 10,000 vests, armored vests from this company, but I don't own any stock in that company. Let's scratch that out. Let's do some backdoor dealing. We're now going to buy these. We're going to give this government contract to a company that I own stock in, so I know that the price of my stock is going to go up, so when I sell it, I'll make more money. I mean, that's not even an exaggeration. That's literally what happens. And as we can imagine, it's 88% of new procurement awards since 2011 being the new system as compared to that 98% government-owned, government-operated. I mean, this is the exact linchpin, archstone that has created the sort of inefficiency and corruption that we're seeing today, right? Let's see here. Federal control over defense production in the Roosevelt administration's rapid response to the attack allowed speedy conversion from civilian to military production at companies such as Ford and General Motors, which went from making automobiles to bombers. So something important to consider here, too, is this doesn't just, the government's capacity to have a stake in production, to have the actual teeth to guide production, doesn't just apply to the wartime economy. Look at how our government responded to COVID-19. Look at how it responded to Hurricane Katrina and the FEMA response to that. This complete laissez-faire privatization of all aspects of government, contracting to private corporations for all aspects of government contracts, affects us in every single way. Case in point was the COVID crisis. We had nothing. We had none of the supplies needed to avert the worst outcomes of that crisis, and we paid the price for it with over 1 million people dead, and how many others left with lifetime side effects from the disease. Right. Let's see here. It says to support small subcontractors that produced war-related materials in government-operated plants. No small group of powerful contractors dominated the industry, unlike today's Big Five. That is Boeing, General Dynamics, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and Raytheon. Some pretty infamous names. I'm sure they have their own skyscrapers in hell, right? Although the scale of weapons production for Ukraine is nowhere near equivalent to what was needed during World War II, that period still provides valuable insight to today's problems. The success of military mobilization during World War II, the ability to become an arsenal democracy, required central planning and government control over industry. So again, like I said, this guy leans a little bit left, but very center left because, he's still very much, I imagine, par for the course with American military and imperial hegemony around the world, right? Even though he's calling for maybe more socialistic or government oversight, it's for the sake of the American empire. It's not for the sake of a better, freer, more well-provided for world, obviously. But the point I want to make here, guys, is although the scale of weapons production for Ukraine is nowhere near equivalent to what was needed during World War II, so I would guess the production difference is compared to Ukraine is what it would need to even potentially win the war if supplies was enough to win a war. It's probably a fraction of percentage of what was needed for World War II. Despite that fact, as we'll see with a later article, the United States is failing to meet production deadlines and supply deadlines for the Ukrainian military. despite the fact of it being a fraction of 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 a percent of the sort of military production capacity that we had in World War II, right? That's pretty telling. And you would maybe just read right through and not notice it, right? Let's go on here, guys. It says, big business. The federal effort to spur employment through defense ended in the 1960s. Defense contractors lobbied Congress to relax government regulations to privatize the industry's operations even before World War II ended. As I imagine FDR was on his way out, very chronically ill, and then when he died, as we know, any good student in history knows, the Trumanites were very right-wing. Right. They were still complicit to a certain degree to the New Deal because that's how they needed to get votes. So you would see after the war, Truman still carrying on a lot of that social welfare state that was produced by the FDR administration. But as we know, they were very unkind to communists and things like that in the post-war world. And we know that Henry Wallace realistically should have been VP for the fourth administration of FDR. Very, very progressive man, especially by today's standards. But even for then, for the Democratic Party, he was probably, realistically, I'm pretty sure he was more progressive, Henry Wallace, than FDR. I mean, FDR was really a plutocrat and aristocrat, and Henry Wallace was taken into the cabinet, or as VP, to kind of buy up that socialist and communist vote that was more militant than the New Deal progressives, right? And as we know, Henry Wallace was fucked out of that VP-ship by internal politics that FDR was not able to handle because he was very much on his way out by the time that fourth term came up. He didn't even stand for his inaugural address or his joint address to Congress because before he'd always kind of go through the thing and get out of his wheelchair to stand and look, prominent. He wasn't even unable to do that during his joint session of Congress. Right. Anyway, it says, when war broke out in 1950, that would be the Korean War, President Harry Truman relied on both executive orders and congressional legislation, including the 1950 Defense Production Act, to spur private, not public, investment in the military. As historian Tim Barker has pointed out, 90% of war production during the Korean War came from private finance. And I want to rewind here just a minute, too, as well. When it talks about, I wanted to make this point earlier, but I failed to. I skipped over it. When it talks about the United States being the arsenal of democracy, let's not forget that the same corporations that were supplying the Allies up until that point, until the U.S. government, through the FDR administration, really started getting invested in the victory of the Allies, even before we joined the war, those companies, big case in point, Henry Ford, known fascist, they were financing, J.P. Morgan financed the Nazis. Henry Ford was like the number one producer for all those engines for the German war machine. And it wasn't until it was outlawed that they stopped doing it. And actually, even after it was outlawed, they kept funneling capital through Swiss banks, which was neutral in the war, and then the Swiss banks would use it to continue financing Hitler's war. So let's not take the arsenal of democracy acronym or analogy too seriously, because the United States corporate machine, corporate infrastructure was financing and industrializing both sides of that war, right? Let's go on here. It says government aimed to create jobs in the private defense sector and in universities working on Pentagon-funded projects. It did not focus on public employment. So this time period is really when we begin to see the cementing of the militarization of the scientific sphere, right, in the technological sphere. World War II, and then this transition, especially with the Trumanites, is when we begin to see that militarization of science and this sort of system that we have now where, particularly here in the U.S. and also Western Europe, if any sort of scientific research and development, scientific designing, tech innovation is going to get done 99% of the time, it has to get done for the sake of the Pentagon, for the sake of the military industrial complex. They don't care if you can create the cure to cancer. They don't care if you can I don't fucking know. Create a chip that lets us all talk to each other worldwide. They don't care if you have a technology that can fundamentally change the way that we live our lives for the better. They don't care if if it's going to be created, if it's going to get financed, if it's going to get the capital needed to be brought to large scale production. It has to be able to spy, torture, maim, and kill human beings. Right? Has to do service for the Pentagon, and then maybe if you're lucky and we can find a mass consumer market for it after it's been employed by the U.S. military, then maybe we can get something nice, right? Case in point, the internet, cell phones, all radar, GPS, all of these things. Okay. Shocked by the Soviet launch of the Sputnik satellite in 1957, Eisenhower signed into law the 1958 National Defense Education Act, which provided government scholarships and loans to Americans pursuing secondary degrees, including doctorates in science and technology related to the defense industry. The program raised the fortunes of the middle class, funding students in need who wish to pursue careers in defense. The National Defense Education Act enhanced the livelihoods of Americans, bringing thousands of Americans in the middle class and setting a precedent for government to subsidize private job creation for the purpose of national security. So a couple ways to look at this. So like it says here, setting the precedent for government to subsidize private job creation. This is where we begin to see that. Back during the New Deal, you saw FDR and his administration and the coalition he had built with socialist, communists, and trade unionists. You saw them just doing straight out government employment, either through the military stuff with the GOGO plants or the Public Works Administration, Civilian Conservation Corps. It didn't go to corporations. There was some stuff that helped people funnel into more corporate jobs. That was going on. They just want to get people employed. But by and large, a huge amount of it, I think they employed 6 to 11 million Americans just straight up through the government through one of these alphabet soup programs, right? CCC, PWA, all that kind of stuff, right? NRA. So during that time, the government was just giving people jobs. Straight up, cut out the middleman. We don't need to bring it to a corporation to get people employed. We're just going to give you a fucking job. You want a job? Here's a goddamn job. I don't care how unskilled you are. If you're so unskilled that you can't even speak right or write, we'll literally give you a pair of scissors and have you go out and cut fucking public lawns or some shit, right? It was literally to that point to get people employed. During the Eisenhower administration, after Truman, we began to see the the U.S. government not just giving people jobs, instead subsidizing corporations to do it, right? And this deeply affected the military-industrial complex, but also set a precedent as a whole for our economy. And as we know, corporations, you can subsidize them all day long to try to do a certain thing, to try to be green energy, to try to up food production and lower food prices, to put people to work in the private defense contract business for the military-industrial complex. But as we know, they don't actually have any real responsibility to make those jobs. They will find every way they can to get as much money from those government subsidized without hiring the people, because then they get to keep even more of those free-ass government dollars, right? So that's one way of looking at this. But the other thing I do want to point out a little bit in between the lines is we don't even do this anymore. Like back then, Eisenhower was no socialist, but 1958 National Defense Education Act, which provided government scholarships and loans to Americans pursuing secondary degrees. We don't even do that anymore. That's even been privatized. So just something else there. We don't even have the infrastructure in place to educate the people necessary for all kinds of jobs, but in particular, the military-industrial complex. You need a fucking brain to make the chemicals that cook people's lungs from the inside out. You need a brain to, produce the weapons that fall from the sky and incinerate children in a single blast. And we don't even have the infrastructure to educate those people anymore, right? Going on here, guys, says, during the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara instituted a series of reforms that both de-emphasized the production of conventional weapons and closed large GOGO facilities. By the time U.S. military operations in Vietnam escalated into a full-fledged war in 1965, Most defense installations were no longer government-owned, government-operated plants. In the years to come, the industry increasingly relied on government-owned, contractor-operated plants that gave companies more leeway to oversee their operations. Right? So what we're seeing here, guys, is during this period, a lot of time the government still owned the plant, owned the land that the plant was on, right? But they said, okay, we own it, we subsidize it, we pay the bills for the plant. Boeing, come on in, make those big boy airplanes, right? So this is another way that they were subsidizing, but at least the government still had control of property. As time went on, we didn't even have that anymore, right? Let's go ahead and polish off this section here, guys, all right? Going on here says, in the decades that followed, the rate of privatization and decline of congressional oversight only quickened when cost overruns and fiscal management almost forced major companies such as Lockheed to near bankruptcy. Defense companies complained of insufficient profits. After Vietnam, there was less pressure on Congress to scrutinize the industry, and the Department of Defense looked to help companies accumulate more profit by encouraging private investment in defense plants and weapons production that set the stage for the 80s and 90s. So by the time we're going into the 80s and 90s, we're looking at an almost entirely privatized military industrial complex. Like, there isn't even true oversight boards anymore. By this time, those oversight boards, if they existed, had been bought up, and you had corporate stooges sitting on them, right? Let's go on here, guys. It says, The Last Supper. After the war ended in 1973 and the defense budget began to shrink, the industry shifted to foreign arms sales. The rise in arms exports to countries in the global south from $404 million in 1970 to $9.9 billion in 1974 also coincided with deindustrialization and the outsourcing of defense manufacturing to foreign countries. This caused plant closures and job losses in domestic manufacturing in the United States. More defense parts were made overseas, and U.S. defense manpower declined by 9.8%. From 1960 to 1975, so just 15 years. Areas of the United States, such as New England, saw a 50% decrease in civilian and military personnel. I mean, these are some pretty wild statistics here, guys. So a couple things here. Those private defense contractors, those private war corporations, as the war, from World War II up through Vietnam, the U.S. was endlessly at war. 45, the war ended. In that interim period, there was a buildup of arms because of the threat of the Soviet Union with the sort of tensions going on in Europe, right? Who's going to control Europe? There was all kinds of little proxy wars and revolutions and things like in Greece and whatnot. And then you had, obviously, the Korean War, which we saw was all privately financed and produced. And then as that war is going on, you're starting to have the buildup in Vietnam. Like, during the time when we're still in Korea, you're already beginning to see the dominoes lying into being set up for Vietnam, right? So from 1941 to 73, the U.S. was involved in some kind of major war or military operation. But then as you see that sort of wheel back, you begin to see the U.S. become this entity that it is today now, one of the biggest arms dealers on the planet. So, after the fall of the Soviet Union, you began to see a lot of the surplus weaponry that the Soviet military had getting into the hands of different groups around the world. But by and large, the U.S. was the one selling all these arms. So all those right-wing lunatics that you saw in Latin America, a lot of the warlords and stuff that you'd see in Africa, I mean, where do you think they were getting these guns a lot of the times? Same obviously in the Middle East or the Near East, right? You had the U.S. military U.S. corporations with the U.S. military serving as a proxy, dumping $404 million worth of weapons in the global south. So if you ever wonder, if you're one of these people that has a white supremacist attitude that maybe you don't realize is white supremacist, brown people, they're always killing each other. It's because they can't. I mean, what do you think that is? It's because the U.S. government sets up proxy organizations and radical groups, i.e., the Taliban, and then these corporations make millions upon millions of dollars in profit, giving them the weapons that they need, right? And then, as we see here, during the age of neoliberalism to 1975, we see these jobs, these industrial war production jobs, shipping out of seas, overseas, which is absolutely crazy to me. And this has only gotten worse from this time period. A huge amount of the pieces and parts and resources and even whole weapon systems that are needed for the U.S. military machine aren't even being produced in the United States. So what the fuck happens if there's an actual war, right? This is a severe chink in the armor of the U.S. military. So what do we have now? We have huge amounts of it being produced overseas. We have corporations completely in charge of it, and they don't care. They're just trying to make money. They don't care about if it's actually done. There's no government oversight. The government owns little to none of the production anymore. Right. So all those pieces that made America a military, a machine of military might in the World War that helped us to win World War and helped save the fucking Allies. Obviously, the Soviet Union won the war as a whole, but the U.S. military saved the Allies, saved the imperialist powers. All of it that made that possible no longer exists. In fact, it's like fucking upside down world now. Right. So a couple of things there, guys. Says, by the 1980s, both the Pentagon and Congress grew increasingly concerned with the overall weaknesses of the defense industrial base. Lawmakers feared that the United States' mushrooming dependence on foreign sources. That was in the 80s. Imagine how bad it is now. In 1988, the Pentagon warned that in a national emergency, the consequences of extensive dependence on foreign sources could be extreme. Again, we saw this being the case not just during war situations during COVID. The consequences in a national emergency, that's for anything. This is one of the major issues with deindustrialization, right? Not just that's cost jobs and cause all sorts of social havoc. It makes our government, even though it's evil fucking fascist state, incapable of dealing with any kind of crisis, right? Another clear sign of imperial decay. Instead, defense spending under Reagan prioritized experimental projects such as the MX missile and the Strategic Defense Initiative, a proposed missile defense system that would protect the United States from nuclear attack, nicknamed the Star Wars program. Excuse me, guys. It cost the U.S. government $30 billion before President Bill Clinton canceled it in 1993. The Reagan administration also poured money into advanced aircraft such as the B-52 stealth bomber and the F-22 stealth fighter over less glamorous purchases of artillery and ammunition. The largest defense companies fared the best under Reagan. American companies that form the core of U.S. defense are finding little support from the Reagan administration. Many have gone bankrupt, particularly the subcontractors in the small business community. So what we're seeing here is not just the privatization, but the conglomeratization to make those big five, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, all those. So now there isn't even any competition. There isn't even the widespread diversity that is needed for healthy production of anything, let alone military production, right? It's all these giant corporations. And now that these giant corporations have control, what do? Well, they've discovered that producing artillery shells, producing rifles, producing ammunition, producing this, that, and the other, the things that the soldiers actually wear, the armored vehicles that they actually need, isn't really that much of a moneymaker. But you know what is a moneymaker is when we get billions of dollars in R&D for missile defense system, for experimental jets and fighters and things like that. With the other thing being that we have no obligation, because we own the government, to actually produce something that works. Something that you've probably seen recently is tens upon tens of billions of dollars, if not $100 billion, being dumped into some new aircraft that looks the same as all the other aircraft, but somehow this one's special. I don't know. Maybe you can tell me if you're a military expert. Somehow it's special. $100 billion spent on it. Doesn't work. Oh, the other one's still better. Haha. So they don't even have an incentive for these experimental projects. They get all the free R&D money from the government. They get the money to pay for it. They get the contracts to produce a bunch of them. It doesn't even work that great. U.S. government doesn't end up using them. It sits in a fucking bone wasteland out in the desert somewhere. Because, of course, also, the Pentagon cannot account in its accounting and its financial affairs for half of its assets, including entire military bases. Entire military bases that the Pentagon's like, I don't even... Well... It says that we have this whole military airstrip, but we don't know where it's at. So, oops. Right. So no oversight, no incentive to actually produce things that you need to fight a war. Let's turn it into a fucking scam, like everything else in the United States. Let's see what else we got here. When reporters uncovered rampant waste and abuse in the procurement process, including the discovery that the U.S. Navy was paying $600 for toilet seats, the 1986 Packard Commission criticized government inefficiency as the source of the problem. It's not government inefficiency. It's corporations using a lack of government oversight to charge $600 for a fucking toilet seat. Something that only got worse, as in the case of Halliburton, was making the U.S. government pay $1,200 to wash a load of laundry. $1,200 per load of laundry. I wish somebody would pay me $1,200 to do the laundry I do at my fucking house, because I would not have to do anything ever again except laundry. Let's see here. The U.S.-based defense workforce would reach its height in the 1980s with 3.2 million people, consistently declining to the present-day number 1.1 million. When the end of the Cold War led to a discussion of a peace dividend, yeah, right, and U.S. policymakers began reevaluating how much to spend on defense, military contractors felt they had to make a choice, consolidate or perish. Contractors got the message and began consolidating. Mergers went from being valued at $300 million in 1990 to $20 billion by 1996. In just 6 years. Crazy. That's how big these corporations got. That's how big these mergers began. The number of contractors for tactile missiles went from 13 to 3. And for fixed-wing aircraft, the number went down from 8 to 2. Clinton hoped consolidation would lower costs. He didn't hope for shit. He just did what corporate masters told him to. And streamlined the contracting process. Neither materialized. Thousands of jobs were lost, and the Clinton administration offered meager assistance to those out of work, because as this was going on and people were losing, millions of jobs were being lost, he completely gutted the federal welfare system and left it up to the states, which is a fucking boondoggle. They don't even use it for welfare. They use it for weird-ass shit. That grant and aid money, man. Consolidation continued to grow during the War on Terror and has now reached record numbers because of the influence of private equity firms, that's your financiers. More than 500 companies have been bought out by private equity in the last 2 decades, which has led further instability and accountability. Also, the high rate of debt, lack of accountability, and higher risk of default with these large firms. Silicon Valley-based defense startups over the past several years have promised innovation in the modernization of the defense industrial base, but those promises have yet to materialize because all of it's just become one big racket, guys. All of it. It's not even just giant defense contractor corporations anymore. It's that those giant defense contractor corporations are owned by giant financial corporations, i.e. BlackRock, i.e. the big 6 financial corporations like Citigroup, JP Morgan and Chase and things like that, right? This is what you're looking at. I mean, the rentier A class, the financial class, owns everything, including the military machine. It's hard to fight a war when you have bankers running the fucking shit that's needed to produce the things to fight the war. Just our society's completely rotten through, including the military, man. Let's polish off this section here, guys. Says, meanwhile, defense contractors have continued to pursue big-ticket items, like we said earlier, over purchases of lower-cost munitions. For example, F-35 Joint Strike Fighter program is estimated to cost $1.6 trillion from start to finish. My number was way off. That, for a jet, you could solve every problem on Earth for that fucking amount of money, man. For a jet. Probably doesn't even work. Anyway, the production of small parts, rocket motors, ball bearings, tubes, steel casings, and other materials essential for the Ukrainians is not as profitable and, until recently, had less importance for both the U.S. government and defense contractors, hoping to maintain contracts for obsolete programs such as littoral combat ships. So that's the thing, too, is these corporations force the U.S. government to maintain contracts for shit that doesn't work or shit that's so fucking outmoded it was better left in the 20th century, but we're still using it in the 21st century. So the keeping of old equipment and old patents and old technology is maintained because these corporations have a private interest in keeping it that way, and they have lackeys in the government to make sure that we keep using old equipment. Right? Crazy stuff, guys. All right, guys, let's keep going here. Let's finish this one off, and then we'll power through the other stuff. This is the bulk of the stuff I wanted to talk about. The other stuff we'll just kind of touch on a little bit here. Let's see here. It says, the home front, this 70-year history of consolidation, privatization, outsourcing, job cuts, federal inaction, and a hunt for larger profits, hang on a second, has created a perfect storm that now hobbles security assistance for Ukraine and potentially for future conflicts as well. Not have the necessary labor force to produce the number of Javelin missiles requested by Ukraine, even after Ukraine burned through a putative 5-year supply of Javelins in the first 6 months of the war. Keep in mind, a part of that is probably because of the severe corruption. Ukraine, before this war, was in Western media called the most corrupt country in Europe, and we've seen video evidence and journalistic reporting on the fact that even on mainstream media, they tried touching on it until they were scolded, that a lot of these military officials in Ukraine are selling off these weapon systems to third parties to make money because they don't give a fuck about the war. They're just fascists that want to make money. It also consumed what was meant to be a 6-year supply of Stinger missiles in just 10 months. One of the few U.S. government-owned contractor-operated plants that produced the black powder needed for artillery rounds exploded in 2021 and was never rebuilt because it could not generate enough profit. That's crazy. Interruptions in global supply chains are also expected to plague the defense industry for the foreseeable future because they produce shit overseas now. And there's limited amounts, keep in mind, there's limited amounts of factories to produce the shit. One of them literally blew up in 2021. Nobody thought it was profitable to rebuild it, so they said, fuck it. So we don't even have it anymore. Comprehensive solutions require government involvement and stronger control over the industry in the immediate and long term. A key takeaway from this time is that greater federal intervention in the defense industry is needed if the industry is to produce otherwise unprofitable weapons. But stockpiling weapons is impossible given the dearth in skilled American labor. Defense contractors have struggled to recruit workers for years in an industry that often requires vocational training or two-year degrees from its employees. To achieve a more stable, trained workforce, the United States must support job creation across all employment sectors, not just defense, so that Americans have the requisite skills and training needed in times of crisis. This is what happens when you put education behind a paywall. And even the imperialists are going to have to bite the bullet on this. It's not just all of us as day-to-day working class people saddled with debt to get a job that don't pay us enough. They don't have the people to run their fucking society. They don't have the people to manufacture their weapons of death even. I mean, they're consuming themselves. They're devouring themselves. This is what late-stage capitalism is. It devours the things necessary to have a functioning society that allows capitalism to exist in the first place. During the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, U.S. soldiers regularly faced shortages in equipment and ammunition. This had much to do with the fact that by 2004, only one plant in Missouri produced ammunition for the entire U.S. military, down from 5 during the Vietnam War. Plus, there was only one manufacturer of protective body armor. For years, the industry, supported by the Pentagon, has tried to do more with less, to consolidate its operations and then ramp up production in times of crisis. How are you going to do that when you have one plant that makes bullets? One plant that makes bullets for the biggest military on the whole fucking planet. The rest of it comes from overseas contractors. That is not a winning recipe. Tell me the U.S. has the most powerful military in the world. It's hanging on by a thread. And the same sort of thing happened to the Roman Empire as well. And then the barbarians came. But this strategy has not worked for the United States in the past and is not working for Ukraine. To better serve Ukraine, the United States must invest more in Americans' futures, not just in its own defense capabilities. So there you guys have it. Absolutely great article outlining the sort of inefficiency and waste and hollowing out of the U.S. defense industry. Now, reading all that, tell me, how powerful do you really think the military machine is? Yeah, they have shock and awe. Yeah, there's these big bombs. Yeah, there's these scary defense systems and missiles and airplanes and shit. But when it comes down to the actual logistics and day-to-day grind and production that's necessary to maintain a military machine, to maintain the biggest empire on the planet, it is not there. It's like held up. It's like a castle on fucking sand, man. That is what we're looking at here. And, just going along with this, that last bit here, here's the article from CBS News. The U.S. could face possible weapon shortage as it continues to supply military aid to Ukraine, war games show. For a couple of key items, the stockpile is getting low, retired Marine Colonel Mark Hansian with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. Pretty sure that's a CIA cutout. If I'm not... Anyway, that might be related to National Endowment for Democracy. Kansian said Ukraine's use of artillery shells far outstrips the Pentagon's capacity to make them. They're using about as much in a month as we produced in a year. So that's pretty telling there, guys. Quote from a U.S. military official pretty high up with this sort of stuff, saying the same thing that this article is saying. But going on to this next part here, guys, we're going to be talking more specifically about corruption. Corruption within military personnel and corruption within defense contractors. So I'm going to go ahead and start this with this quick little video right here, guys. It's 3 minutes long. This video is older now. It's about 10 years old. But it outlines a bunch of corruption scandals that were going on during the height of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I'm just going to play it for you guys because it really does sort of, paint a quick picture of how problematic, how systematic this is. And then we're going to get into some more instances of this as well with another article. So we'll go ahead and play this here for you guys.
The U.S. Navy, the Air Force, and the Army National Guard are all under the dark cloud of corruption investigations. The incidents stretch from the plains of Montana, where nuclear ICBMs sit in silos ready for launching, to National Guard facilities all over the United States, and to the ports of East Asia, where U.S. Navy ships make calls. The situation led U.S. Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel Friday to announce the appointment of a senior general to focus on ethics.
Ethics and character are the foundation of an institution and a society. They must be constantly emphasized at every level of command, in training, curriculum, and all phases of DoD in both the officer and the enlisted corps, top to bottom.
On Capitol Hill, a congressional committee on government oversight, chaired by California Congressman Darrell Issa, will hold hearings into a Navy scandal involving a Singapore-based company, Glenn Defense Marine Asia. Investigators say the company's chairman, Leonard Glenn Francis, bribed U.S. Navy officers with cash, luxury trips, and prostitutes to steer business to his company. Francis was arrested and awaits trial. One of the Navy officers arrested in the probe is Michael Misowitz, a child refugee from Cambodia and ex-commander of a guided missile destroyer. Misowitz also was a deputy logistics officer for the Navy's 7th Fleet, which patrols the Pacific. Prosecutors say Misowitz accepted bribes from Francis to divert U.S. vessels to ports where Francis' company could service and overcharge the Navy. Misowitz has pled not guilty and awaits trial. Another Navy corruption scandal involves the famed SEAL Team 6. The scheme involves silencers manufactured for SEAL weapons. The equipment cost $8,000 to make, but was billed to the military for $1.6 million. The incident triggered Navy Secretary Ray Mabus to ask for the resignation of Acting Undersecretary Robert Martinage. Meanwhile, the Air Force is investigating whether at least 92 officers cheated on tests that ensure top proficiency among those who control and launch America's nuclear ICBMs. And the Navy is looking into a similar cheating scandal. Enlistment.
I just want to stop for 1 second, guys, because that one is crazy. That one is completely fucking insane. The people that are in charge of the nuclear defense system, the nuclear warheads that could end all life on the planet, cheated on their tests to make sure they were competent enough to be in charge of that. What? Here, let's go on here, guys.
At the U.S. Army National Guard are under a cloud. The U.S. Senate recently held hearings into allegations that recruiters and others scammed up to $66 million in a scheme involving enlistment bonuses. Brookings Institution analyst Michael O'Hanlon says it's time for the Pentagon to crack down.
You start to wonder if we need to get a little more disciplined here, if nothing else than to send a very clear message that this kind of stuff needs to be rooted out, and whatever kind of laxity and oversight might be happening is not tolerable or sustainable.
O'Hanlon says the scandals erode the nation's safety and security, and over time can damage the very fabric and reputation of the armed forces. Jeffrey Young, VOA News.
All right, guys, so there you have it. Some pretty crazy examples of corruption, and we're going to get into a few more here with this article right here. This stuff is from top to bottom. This is from the Center for Public Integrity. U.S. military personnel have been convicted of $50 million worth of crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan. So this article kind of examines some of the instances in those wars of people from enlisted all the way up to the officer corps using the war for personal profit, doing all kinds of scams, cheating taxpayers out of their dollars by siphoning off different equipment and supplies and selling it to a third party and shit, right? So we got some key findings here. It says, since 2005, 115 U.S. service members have been convicted of crimes valued at more than $50 million in Iraq and Afghanistan, including stealing, rigging contracts, and taking bribes. The U.S. military's dependence on large cash transactions, its hasty contract award process, the absence of serious oversight, and a culture of local corruption helped lure U.S. service members to commit these crimes. I like the choice of words, lure. They were seduced. U.S. Inspectors General for Iraq and Afghanistan say that far more fraud has been committed by military personnel than has been prosecuted so far. Several soldiers who participated in crimes say they saw colleagues doing it and viewed the chances of getting caught as slim. Investigators of these crimes say that their work has been stymied by the challenge of tracking down funds in foreign bank accounts, and that courts sometimes impose lighter penalties than they think the crimes deserve. So pretty endemic problem of corruption, right? Says U.S. Army Specialist Stephanie Charbonneau sat at the center of a complex trucking network in forward operating base Fenty near the Afghanistan-Pakistan border that daily distributed tens of thousands of gallons of what soldiers called liquid gold, the refined petroleum that fueled the international coalition's thirstiest vehicles, planes, and generators. A prominent sign in the base read, "The Army won't go if the fuel don't flow." But Charbonneau, 31, a mother of two from Washington State, felt alienated after the supervisor's harsh rebuke. Her work was a dreary routine of recording fuel deliveries in a computer and escorting trucks past a gate. But it was soon to take a dark turn into high-value crime. She began an affair with a civilian, Jonathan Hightower, who worked for a Pentagon contractor that distributed fuel from Fenty. And one day in March 2010, he told her about this quote-unquote thing going on at other U.S. military bases around Afghanistan. She recalled in a recent telephone interview. Soldiers were selling U.S. military's fuel to Afghan locals on the side and pocketing the proceeds. When Hightower suggested they started doing the same, Charbonneau said she agreed. In so doing, Charbonneau contributed to thefts by U.S. military personnel of at least $15 million worth of fuel since the start of the U.S. war in Afghanistan, and she eventually became one of at least 115 enlisted personnel and military officers convicted since 2005 of committing theft, bribery, and contract ribbing crimes valued at $52 million. Yeah, guys, this just goes on and on. Completely endemic. As of February, he said they had 327 active investigations still underway involving 31 members of the military. You don't appreciate how much money is being stolen in Afghanistan until you go there, Sopko said, who says price fixing and other forms of financial corruption are rampant in the country. He said retired Army Reserve Major Major Glenn McDonald, whose reports about fraud, waste, and abuse in the military reach a monthly web audience of up to 6 million, said the volume and value of fraud committed by soldiers of Afghanistan and Iraq seems higher to him than what he recalled as a young man soldier in Vietnam in the 1960s. And in Vietnam, the war was notorious. People were selling off everything, including fucking helicopters and shit. Right? You see that in movies, you see that in documentaries and shit. To describe the system as loosely controlled might be an understatement. Standard contracts allowed each driver to take 7 days to bring the fuel to a destination that might only be a few hours away. According to Army Major Jonathan McDougall, who oversaw motor vehicle logistics in northeast Afghanistan in 2010 and 2011 from Brigham Airfield, it was like they planned for something to go wrong with every convoy. Fuel pilferage was a leading cause of failed deliveries. According to McDougall, 1 out of every 3 truck convoys would lose, on average, about 11,000 gallons of fuel. Crazy. So it talks about what she'd do. She says she'd order trucks to transport more fuel than needed, then filed fake records showing the extra fuel had been delivered to a base. After leaving Fenty in a convoy, the extra trucks diverted their loads to prearranged meeting spots where buyers offloaded the fuel and paid in cash. While the proceeds divided later among Charbonneau and her co-conspirators, the scheme worked for a while because the fuel storage amounts and truck delivery amounts matched. Crazy stuff here, guys. Another one here is an Army captain for Tacoma, Washington, named Cedar Landmon, who served in Iraq on 2 deployments from 2004 to 2007, accepted gifts worth tens of thousands of dollars in exchange for helping the Albanian owner of a company called Just in Time Contracting obtain a $250,000 contract from the U.S. military. So this stuff is just crazy, guys, and it goes on and on and on. And we can move into this next piece here that I have, an example of some of the, because that one was related to defense contracts, successful defense contract fraud cases and awards. We're going to read through a little bit of this, just giving an example of how endemic it really is. All right, so this here is some examples of different ways that this contracting fraud has. Halliburton, we have a press release here from the SEC, is an example of some of the ways Halliburton scammed. Like I said, the laundry incident. This one's one from the 90s. They've been scamming the U.S. government for pretty much the whole lifespan of the company. But you have mischarging for food. Agility Public Warehousing Co., a Kuwaiti company under contract with the DoD, was accused of overcharging for food supplied to U.S. soldiers in Kuwait. They paid $95 million. Product substitution with defective bulletproof vests. More than $132 million were paid by body armor manufacturers, weavers, and international trading companies, including Toyobo Company of Japan and its American subsidiary Toyobo USA. Sold defective Xylon fiber used in bulletproof vests. Studies found that over half of the vests could not stop bullets, and they had been certified to stop. Mischarging for goods and services. Inchcape Shipping Services paid $20 million to reserve allegations of overbilling the U.S. Navy for services to Navy ships at ports in several regions throughout the world. Classic. False statements regarding ineligibility for contract, so lying about what they're capable of doing and what they plan on doing. Product substitution with defective combat earplugs. You've probably seen ads for this one. 3M company paid $9.1 million to sell allegations that it knowingly sold to the U.S. military defective dual-end combat earplugs. Mischarging via inflated labor hours. Northrop Grumman Systems agreed to pay $27 million to settle the government's allegations that it overstated the numbers of hours its employees worked on the battlefield airport communications node. Similar thing happens with their new weapon systems, what we talked about earlier. Product substitution with defective communication systems. Lockheed Martin agreed to pay $4.4 million for allegedly submitting false statements in the course of providing defective communication systems to the Coast Guard. Deceptive pricing via impermissible expenses. I mean, guys, it just goes on and on and on. These contractors are deeply embedded in the government, like we talked about, insider trading. The people that are supposed to be doing the oversight in Congress, they own stock in the corporations. The people appointed to the oversight boards are former Raytheon executives, case in point, Biden's administration. So all the way from the very base of how the U.S. war machine handles logistics and production, completely hollowed out, privatized, shipped overseas, riddled with corruption to produce experimental designs rather than the things that needed to actually run a military, to enlistees and officers being deeply corrupt, robbing the U.S. government, emphasizing and focusing on lining their own pockets. What do you expect to happen? We have a gangster culture that is the American society. And then all the way up to the largest corporations in the country, the largest defense contractors, the big five, completely gaming the system to make profits every step of the way, from the lowest corporate guy to the fucking CEO. This is all I have here, guys. I'm going to go ahead and round it off for you because I'm getting a little wore out. But I hope I've painted the image of you guys that despite the propaganda of how powerful and efficient and patriotic the American military American military machine is, it too is decaying from the inside out. It is suffering from the imperial decay that is festering and corrupting every aspect of the American system. Every institution in our society has been privatized, hollowed out, shipped overseas, bought up by gangsters, held by corporate stooges that have no investment in the American project, in the American country, in the American people. Rather, their only God is money. And we can see that even in the military machine. So we have to ask the question that come a severe crisis, come a hot war or a series of proxy wars with China or Russia, what will be the outcome? And there's been, war games recently that has the Pentagon and military brass hats terrified, that shows that the U.S. military cannot win a war with China, yet we are going barrel long down this Cold War leading towards a hot war with China. And as all of this shows, the U.S. military machine that is supposed to be the one linchpin it still has is incredibly kleptocratic, plutocratic, gangsterish, and rotten through to its very core. So let that be something you bring up when people talk about the American empire. I don't know, guys. It just shows to me another example of how the U.S. empire is on its way out and how much longer it can carry on like this. It's hard to say. What will that final decay look like? What will the changing of these systems look like? I can't say. But one can imagine with a military this rotten through, with this many people having no moral compass, engaging in profiteering and outright fraud, larceny, every imaginable form of corruption. You can imagine a world that, as the polity of the United States begins to collapse in the domestic sphere, as a result probably of the wars that are on the horizon, as a result of the complete economic collapse that we're just barely staving off now, you can see elements in this military sort of partitioning off portions of the country and forming little warlordships or fiefdoms in conjunction with some of these corporate entities. Obviously that's all speculative, and who can know what will happen when the can of worms is opened and laid out for everybody to see. But it's definitely interesting to think about. With that, guys, go ahead and drop a comment. Let me know what you think about all this. Do you have any more information to contribute to this discussion? What does this imperial military decay spell for the collapse of the empire as a whole? What role does this play, this military decay, in the creation of a new world or the changing of events as the world moves forward? Go ahead, drop a comment. Let me know what you guys think. With that, guys, I'm going to go ahead and round it off here. Again, like, subscribe, comment, all that. Help me out with the algorithm. Don't forget you can join me on Patreon, support my independent media work there for as little as $1 a day. I hope to see you guys on there. Thanks again to all the patrons, everyone that's consistently watching the show, everyone that subscribes, likes, provides financial support for me. Everything makes a difference, and you guys are awesome. As always, guys, it's great hanging out with you. It's great speaking with you, talking about the issues, and I look forward to speaking with you again soon. Bye.